Krista Brady, and today I'll be talking to you about the eye and other vision structures. Let's start off by talking a little bit about how your brain will receive and recognize vision information. So this diagram here is showing us a representation of a transverse section through the brain. Here are your eyeballs here, and here's your optic nerve coming out, cranial nerve 2, the optic nerve coming out from each eye. And these nerves are going to meet and cross over at a place called the optic chiasma, or the optic chiasm. You'll see it both ways. At that point, they do exchange some of the axon fibers, and then they continue as optic tracts from there. And so the optic tracts are named right or left based on what side of the body they're on, not on which eye they're carrying visual information from. So here we have the right optic nerve, here is the right optic tract. The optic tracts will then synapse in the thalamus, and then they will synapse on the third order sensory neurons, which will travel in the optic radiations out to the primary visual cortex in the occipital lobe of the cerebrum. So one more time, our vision information is going to come into the eye and be detected by the optic nerve, which will travel from the eye to the optic chiasma, where it will exchange some fibers with the optic nerve from the other side, and then those fibers will continue on as optic tracts, which will then synapse in the thalamus on the optic radiations, which will then travel out to the primary visual cortex in the occipital lobe. And one other thing that I'll point out here is this optic chiasma is located just above the pituitary gland. And so one major symptom of pituitary tumors is visual defects. Now here we're looking at the eye and the structures that surround it. So I'm going to give you a brief refresher on the extraocular muscles, the extrinsic eye muscles. So we've got our lateral rectus muscle here, inferior oblique, which comes around and attaches on the lateral side of the eyeball. Inferior rectus coming straight underneath. Superior rectus coming straight on top. And then we would have superior oblique coming around to attach obliquely, diagonally, on the superior surface, and then medial rectus is the straight muscle on the medial side, which we can't see on this chart. There's one more that you should remember from our muscle unit, which is this one coming up and over and inserting on the upper eyelid here. This is levator palpebrae superioris. Levator palpebrae superioris. And so you don't have to remember the actions of most of these. You do need to remember that levator palpebrae superioris opens your eyelids. You also need to remember the innervations of these. So remember that most of them are innervated by cranial nerve 3 oculomotor, including levator palpebrae superioris. But there are two exceptions. Lateral rectus is innervated by cranial nerve 6 abducens, and superior oblique is innervated by cranial nerve 4, the trochlear nerve. Now let's look at some of the other structures. So we've got the lacrimal gland right up here. The lacrimal gland will produce tears in a process called lacrimation. And it does that under the control of cranial nerve 7, the facial nerve. This is one of the autonomic functions of cranial nerve 7, is to cause production of tears, lacrimation. Those tears will travel over the surface of the eye, and then they will pass through a series of canals and eventually into the nasal cavity. And we'll cover that pathway on a future, a little farther on in this video. On this chart, we can also see the eyelids, which have a special name. The eyelids are called the palpebrae. So this is the superior palpebra, and this is the inferior palpebra. And the superior and inferior palpebra will be lined with a mucous membrane called the palpebral conjunctiva. So you've probably heard of conjunctivitis. That's inflammation of that delicate mucous membrane that lines the internal part of the eyelids as well as the anterior part of the eyeball itself. When it lines the anterior part of the eyeball, it is called the bulbar conjunctiva because it is lining the bulb or ball of the eye there. And conjunctivitis is inflammation of those delicate mucous membranes. Here we have another chart that shows us the lacrimal apparatus that is going to produce and remove tears. So again, here we have the lacrimal gland up here on the lateral side of the eye. So that's a great landmark if you are trying to orient yourself. The lacrimal gland is on the lateral side, and this will produce tears under the control of cranial nerve 7, the facial nerve, and those tears will wash across the surface of the eye and nourish the cornea, which is the clear covering that protects the colored part of our eye. So it washes across the cornea, nourishes that, and then it drains through the lacrimal canals, also called the lacrimal canaliculi, which are these small little passageways at the corner of the eye here, and those drain into the lacrimal sac. And then the tears will follow this passageway down the nasolacrimal duct and pass into the nasal cavity. And this is why when you cry, your nose starts to run, because those tears are draining into the nasal cavity. Here we're looking at a sagittal section of the eye. So let me point out first, the white part of your eye is called the sclera. This is a tough fibrous coating that protects your eye. And then here covering the colored part of your eye, we have the clear cornea, which has many layers, and the cornea is going to allow light to pass through, and it will also actually refract light. The cornea does the majority of light refraction, which is bending light so that it will pass into your eye. So these are the cornea and the sclera. And then moving inwards, we have this layer, which is red in this chart here. This is the choroid, also called the choroid coat. And the choroid has lots and lots of blood vessels to supply the retina and the sclera with blood and with oxygen and nutrients. Okay, moving towards the anterior part of the eye, we have this large structure here, which is the ciliary muscle. And the ciliary muscle will go all the way around in a circle around the lens, which is this large structure right here. And the ciliary muscles are attached to the lens by way of these little tiny threads, these ciliary zonules, also called suspensory ligaments. And those also go all the way around the lens. And so the ciliary muscle, when it contracts, it's going to contract inwards, and that will relax the ciliary zonules and allow the lens here to bulge more, to form a more circular shape. And that's actually important for near vision. That will allow for better accommodation of the lens so that the light will hit the right part of your retina for you to detect and interpret near images. So we've talked about the ciliary muscles and the ciliary zonules, and then we've got these structures, the lines here coming up towards the lens. These are the ciliary processes. The ciliary processes are going to produce aqueous humor, a type of fluid. That aqueous humor will go into the posterior chamber right here in between the lens and this part here, which is the iris. So they'll go into the posterior chamber and then pass through the pupil into the anterior chamber, which is this part here between the iris and the cornea. And then that will drain out through the scleral venous sinus, or the canal of Schlemm. And if that gets blocked, then that can cause a buildup of aqueous humor, which is called glaucoma. All right, so I've talked a lot about the iris already, so let me formally introduce that. The iris is the colored part of your eye And in addition to having pigment that helps to absorb extra light waves, the iris also has two muscles in it. The sphincter pupillae muscle will allow the iris to contract to make the pupil, the opening in the iris, to make that smaller, to decrease the amount of light that is entering the eye. So this happens, of course, when we're in bright light, but also when we want to focus on a near image. We need to have constriction of the pupil via those sphincter pupillae muscles. The other muscle in the iris is the dilator pupillae muscle, which will dilate the pupil. And so that is under the control of the sympathetic nervous system, and we will dilate our pupils when we are experiencing a sympathetic nervous system reaction where we're stressed or afraid or exercising. And we will also dilate the eye when we need to see something farther away, because that's better for far vision. So we've talked about most of the structures here of the ciliary muscles and so on. And then this whole inner area here. So this whole area that is shown in yellow, and then all of this internal part is the retina, which is the part of the eye that actually contains photoreceptors, which will detect light. So those photoreceptors are concentrated particularly in the macula lutea, which is a particular place that is right at the back of your eye, slightly lateral, and especially in one point right in the center of that macula lutea, which is called the fovea centralis. I'll show you that on another chart, another part of the chart here as well. And then you can see this part where we've got all of the blood vessels entering and leaving the eye, as well as the optic nerve leaving the eye. That is called the optic disc. And that is what creates the blind spot in your vision. So there's actually a part of your part of your field of view where you actually can't see things and your brain just fills that in. That's your blind spot. And then I will also point out that this whole posterior part is called the posterior segment or the posterior cavity, and it's filled with a gel-like substance called the vitreous humor or the vitreous body. And that vitreous body is going to help keep the retina pushed up against the choroid so that the retina can be nourished by the choroid. And if that vitreous humor starts to degrade as we age, starts to get smaller, then that can cause the retina to come away from the choroid and cause retinal detachment, which can cause permanent damage to the retina. So the retina is pushed up against the choroid by the vitreous humor that fills this posterior segment, and the retina is also tacked down to the choroid at this serrated edge here. So see how it's scalloped or serrated? This is called the ora serrata. The ora serrata. And the ora serrata tacks down the retina to the choroid. Here we've got two different views. We've got this view as if you're looking through the pupil at the back of the retina. So here we can see the optic disc, which is where all of the blood vessels enter and exit the eye, and where the optic nerve leaves the eye. And right over here we can see this darker spot. This is the macula lutea. The macula lutea is a place that has a high concentration of cones, which are the photoreceptors that detect color and that are also better at detecting sharper images. And then right in the center of the macula lutea, we have a point called the fovea centralis, which has the highest concentration of cones. And it is where we get our most acute vision when light falls on that fovea centralis. So this is why if you see something out of the corner of your eye, you turn your head so that you can look directly at it so that the light waves fall directly on that fovea centralis and you can see it more clearly. Now over here we have one other diagram that I want to draw your attention to. This is a diagram of the retina. So the retina does have several layers of cells, and there's one layer that you'll need to know for your lab, which is this last layer here. So it's the deepest layer of the retina. It is right up against the choroid, and it has cells that produce melanin. Melanin is that dark pigment, and so the pigmented layer of the retina here, also called the pigmented epithelium, will help absorb stray light so that we can get sharper images to interpret. Here we're looking at a model of the eye. So let's go over the structures that we've seen on the chart so far. So we've got the extrinsic eye muscles. We've got superior rectus up here. We've got the tendon from superior oblique coming in to insert obliquely on the top part of the eye. We've got medial rectus right here, and we've got lateral rectus. And how did I know that those were medial and lateral? Well, one clue is this lacrimal gland, which is on the lateral side, the lacrimal gland on the lateral side. Another clue is the superior oblique muscle comes in from the medial side to insert on the top. And then one final clue is that the inferior oblique muscle, which we can see part of right here, the inferior oblique muscle comes in to insert on the lateral side of the eyeball. And then we can see a little bit of inferior rectus there at the bottom. Now let's go into the eye. Okay, so here we've got the iris, which is the colored part of the eye here, and that's surrounding the pupil, the opening into your eye. And the iris, again, will have those sphincter pupillae and dilator pupillae muscles that will control the size of the pupil to control how much light is entering the eye. And then we've got this clear covering over the iris, which is the cornea. And remember that the white part of the eye is the sclera. I'm going to remove that so we can see what's behind it. So here we have this, this clear ovaline structure, which is the lens. And the lens does accommodation, which means that it will change shape to help control where the light is focusing on the retina. We've also got this clear ball, which is representing the vitreous humor that would fill the posterior segment of the eye here behind the lens. And then we've got this structure at the back, which is coming out the back of the eye. So that is representing the optic nerve, cranial nerve 2. And again, this place where the optic nerve leaves, that is the optic disc that creates the blind spot of your vision. Okay, so removing those, we can see inside the eye. So we can see the retina, all this inner layer here. We can see the ora serrata, which is that serrated edge which tacks down the retina. We can see the ciliary processes, these lines coming up towards the lens, and the ciliary processes again produce aqueous humor that they will secrete into the posterior chamber between the lens and the back of the iris. Okay. We can also see this little spot right here, which is representing the macula lutea. And then we would have the fovea centralis right at the very center of that. And so today I've taught you about the eye and the other structures associated with vision, including the muscles that control eyeball movement, the lacrimal gland and the lacrimal apparatus that will drain the tears, as well as the structures of the eyeball itself, the cornea and sclera, the ciliary muscles and zonules, the lens, the iris, and so on. Now go ahead and practice these using the labeled and unlabeled images in your Learning Lab PowerPoint, and then you can apply these on the lab quizzes.